responding to is the use of racial profiling has created a negative impact in our communities. So the opponent's secondary claims were racial profiling compromises our future, racial profiling creates mistrust, and racial profiling produces alienation and a diminished sense of citizenship. So my response to the claim one, in his claim one, racial profiling compromises our future, the advocate states that racial profiling on children has led to antisocial behavior. So the arguer presents one of his evidence in supporting claim as an interview with David R. Alford, director of the Canadian Centre for Studies of Children at Risk. Once, and this is the quote that he used, once kids are out of the mainline and expelled, then they are on a different path for sure. It can have an impact on the community in which they live, and of course it contributes to an important problem in Canada. So the claim was originally the use of racial profiling created a negative impact in our communities, but when I looked up the article that he used, it was just about Canada's community. So I found that interesting, how there wasn't any data on how our communities around us, like in the US, are affected by racial profiling. So I think that could have been added to support the racial profiling has created a negative impact in our communities. So a definition of community is defined as a social group of any size whose members reside in a specific locality, share government, and often have a common cultural and historic heritage. So Canada isn't really within our community, so I thought that weakened his argument. And then to respond to secondary claim 2, racial profiling creates mistrust. So I found out that although it does create mistrust, it is a sort of costly lenience in the police departments. It can often cut the funding the police department gets because they know where to look for criminals, and it just cuts the resources that they use. And then I found a quote in Racial Profiling Pros and Cons list, knowing what type of person fits the profile of the criminal they are looking for can save a lot of resources. Okay, and then response to secondary claim 3, racial profiling produces alienation and diminished sense of citizenship. So in the arguer's secondary claim, his evidence states that racial profiling produces alienation and diminished sense of society. He proves that in an article, The Effects of Racial Profiling, and his evidence consisted of individuals who felt that they had accomplished much and were contributing significantly to Canadian society, and their sense of value added to Canadian society. They are still assumed to be part of an undesirable element of society, and this was very distressing to them. So throughout the article that I read online where he found his evidence, so there was testimonies of people who have felt racial profiling had affected them, but many of the testimonies did not give specific examples as to what happened to them to make them feel that way, or how a racial profiling has really, an example of how racial profiling really affected them in their lives. So they just state their emotions and how it affected them, but doesn't really give supporting examples as to the situations that occurred to those people. And again, that was only within the community, the Canadian community, and not the US. And that was it. Mm-hmm.
Right, structurally set up the advocate's claims pretty clearly. On the first point, when you talk about it compromising the future, most of your argument is really about the fact that the evidence comes from Canadian research as opposed to U.S. communities. That's a reasonable press on the argument. I'm not sure how substantially different Canadian communities are from U.S. communities, and whether or not we'd have a different reaction from people who are affected by racial profiling. Like I said, it's what we would call a press. It's an argument to make when you don't have other things to say, and it forces an answer if we were having a debate, but it doesn't necessarily convince or persuade us that the argument is unsound to begin with. It sounds more, when you're presenting this, like you're giving an evaluation rather than a response to the argument. I think that's a little bit problematic. Your definition of community is okay. Maybe that extends the argument a little bit, but I still think that it's really a little overdone. I think that you are making a generalization here that is less. Well, I think that's the argument you ought to be making, is that the advocate is making a generalization and their evidence may not be representative of the population that they're trying to describe. But it would be helpful if you could suggest why there are substantial differences. I'm not sure that the differences that exist would favor the position that you would otherwise be taking. On the second point, you don't really dispute the question of whether or not it creates mistrust. So it's like you're conceding that particular point, and you simply have a counterclaim that says, but it does save money. So, I'm not exactly sure that that's the best answer to an argument here. It's, why is saving money more important than the mistrust that is created? Give us a little bit of a context. If it's a value argument, then there might be a reason to make that point. As it is, I think that that's... Excuse me. I think I have one more there, but maybe not. Sorry. So it's not really relevant to the claim that's being presented there. Sugar. It's there. It just doesn't want to come out. And on the alienation issue, we're back to the Canadian argument again, which, like I said, it's at least an argument to make, but it seems like it's underdeveloped. It seems like there hasn't been sufficient research to talk about these sorts of things. And I think you're accepting a pretty important premise to begin with, that racial profiling exists or that it is extensive. I think that might be a good place to have a more general argument that responds to this issue, and you just sort of seem to accept that it exists without even challenging that premise. All right, thank you.